The carriage stopped in front of Holt Manor at 10 minutes past 3, and Isadora Pemberton did not cry. She had promised herself that much at least. The house was stone and silence. 3 stories of it, with windows that caught no light, and a front door that hung slightly off its frame, as if it itself had given up on keeping the world out. The gardens on either side of the drive had gone to seed. Not recently, but thoroughly, the kind of neglect that takes years to achieve. Ivy had crawled up the eastern wall and begun pulling at the mortar. A stone bench near the gate had cracked in two, and no one had bothered to move either half. Isadora stepped down from the carriage and stood with her hands folded in front of her, her traveling case at her feet. The driver did not wait. She heard the wheels on the gravel behind her, and then there was only wind. She was 23 years old. She had been married for 4 hours. Her husband, Julian Holt, had shaken her hand at the church steps and told her the housekeeper's name was Mrs. Foss and that there was an account at the village market she could draw from for household needs. He had said this the way a man tells a stranger the location of the nearest inn. Courteous, precise, and entirely without warmth. Then he had gotten into a separate carriage and driven in the opposite direction. Isadora looked at the house. The house looked back. She picked up her case and walked to the door. Mrs. Foss was a woman of 60 with a face like weathered wood and eyes that missed nothing. She answered the door before Isadora could knock, which meant she had been watching from the window, which meant she had known when to expect her, and had still waited to see what kind of woman would step out of that carriage. "Mrs. Holt," she said. The name landed strangely. Isadora had not yet learned to recognize it as hers. "Mrs. Foss," she said. "I understand you've been managing the house." "Keeping it standing," Mrs. Foss said, which was a different thing, and they both knew it. The entrance hall smelled of damp and old wood. There were sheets over the furniture in the parlor. The chandelier above the stairs was missing half its candles. Isadora walked through each room on the ground floor, with Mrs. Foss trailing behind her, and she did not let her face show anything. Her mother had taught her that. A woman who lets her face show everything gives the world too much to work with. In the small room off the kitchen that served as a household office, Isadora found what she was actually looking for. A desk, a ledger, and a tin box that rattled when she lifted it. "The household accounts," she said. "Not a question." "Such as they are," Mrs. Foss said. Isadora opened the ledger. The first thing she noticed was that the handwriting changed 3 times in 4 years. The second thing she noticed was that several lines had been crossed out and rewritten with figures that didn't match the totals at the bottom of each column. The third thing she noticed, and this was the thing that made her set the ledger down very carefully and sit in the chair that creaked beneath her, was that there was a quarterly withdrawal listed simply as estate services. Greer & Son, that had been paid every 3 months without interruption, for 7 years, totaling an amount that could have restaffed the house twice over. "Who is Greer & Son?" she asked. Mrs. Foss stood very still in the doorway. "They manage the farmland to the north, the lease arrangements, the tenant payments." "Have you ever met them?" A pause. "No, ma'am." "Has Mr. Holt?" A longer pause. "Not to my knowledge." Isadora closed the ledger. She looked at the window, small, north-facing, looking out onto the vegetable garden that had gone entirely to weeds, and she thought about what her father had told her the week before the wedding. He had said Julian Holt was a man of respectable family and reduced circumstances, that the match made practical sense, that Isadora's head for figures would serve her well in managing a complicated estate. He had made it sound like a job. She had understood even then that it was. She was not angry about it. Anger required a certain kind of surprise, and she had not been surprised. What she had not expected was the scale of the mess. She opened the ledger again and began from the first page. She did not see Julian for 6 weeks. He sent a letter at the end of the first week, brief and formal, asking whether she had settled in adequately and whether anything was required. She wrote back with a list, not of personal needs, she had few of those, but of practical questions. The terms of the Greer & Son agreement, the name of the solicitor who managed the estate, whether any improvements had been made to the tenant cottages in the last decade, and if so, who had authorized them. His response, when it came, was a single paragraph expressing vague confidence in her capacity to manage as she saw fit, and the name of a man called Mr. Aldous Greer, who could be reached at an address in Concord. She wrote to Mr. Aldous Greer. Mr. Aldous Greer did not write back. She wrote again, this time with specific questions attached. The original contract, the acreage under management, the names of the tenants and the rents they paid. She was very polite about it. She had learned, in the household of a man who ran a trading company, that politeness in correspondence was a form of pressure, because it made refusal look like rudeness. Mr. Greer's response, when it arrived 3 weeks later, was courteous and almost entirely without information. He confirmed that his firm had managed the northern farmland for some years. He said the accounts were in order. He wished Mrs. Holt well in her new position. She folded the letter, placed it in the tin box with the others, and sent a third letter, this one not to Mr. Greer, but to the solicitor's office in Boston that Julian had named. She asked for the original estate agreement and any contracts held on behalf of Holt Manor. Then she put on her boots and walked out to the north fields herself. The farmland was not abandoned. That was the first surprise. She had half expected another version of the house. Neglect made visible, weeds and silence. Instead, the fields were planted and tended, the tenant cottages in reasonable repair, the fences solid. A man named Silas was mending a gate at the edge of the closest field, and he straightened when he saw her coming. "Mrs. Holt," he said, cautious. "Silas," she said, "how long have you farmed this land?" "My father before me, ma'am." 22 years for me. "And who do you pay rent to?" He looked at her in a way she would come to recognize over the following weeks. The particular wariness of a person who has been told one thing for a long time and is only now being asked if they've ever thought to question it. "To the Greer office," he said. "In Concord. Every quarter. And have you ever received a receipt?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Papers," he said. "From Mr. Greer. Signed by whom?" He thought about it. Just his name. Greer. She thanked him and walked back to the house in the wind which had come up cold off the hills to the north. She was not angry, exactly. She was building a picture, the way you build a ledger, one entry at a time. Each figure placed precisely in its column, the work patient and cumulative. The picture was not finished yet, but she could see its shape. When she got back to the office, she wrote a fourth letter. This one went to the county recorder's office, requesting the deed records for the farmland parcels. She also wrote to a firm in Boston that her father had once mentioned, not a law firm, but a financial agency that handled estate disputes. She sent the letters. She went to bed. She was not frightened. She was, in some way she did not have a word for yet, more awake than she had been in a long time. Julian came back on a Thursday. She heard the carriage on the drive, and came to the front window of the office. She had claimed the office entirely by now, the sheets off the furniture, her own books beside the ledgers, a small lamp she had brought from her bedroom, placed on the corner of the desk because the overhead light was weak. She watched him step out of the carriage. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, contained, with the expression of a man who has learned to show very little, because showing things has cost him. She knew about that kind of economy. She practiced it herself. He came inside. Mrs. Foss met him in the hall. Isadora waited. He knocked on the office door before entering. She noted that. He had every right to simply walk in, and he knocked. "Mrs. Holt," he said. "Mr. Holt," she said. And then, because she thought it would matter to both of them to get past formality quickly, "Sit down. There are things I need to show you." He sat. She placed the ledger in front of him and opened it to the Greer & Son page. She had marked the relevant entries with small slips of paper. She walked him through it the way her father had taught her to walk through numbers. Without drama, without emphasis, just sequence and fact. When she finished, Julian was quiet for a long moment. "How long?" he said. "At least 7 years at this rate. Possibly longer. The earlier ledgers are missing, which is itself a problem. The missing ledgers, yes. Someone removed them. I can't tell you who, but I can tell you when. The gap starts the quarter after your father died." Julian looked at the page. His face did not change, but something in his jaw did, a tightening that she suspected he didn't know was visible. "Greer sent you a letter," he said. "He sent me too. Both useless. I've also written to your solicitor and to the county recorder." She paused. "I hope that doesn't trouble you. I can share the correspondence if you'd like to review it." "No," he said slowly. "I would not have thought to." He stopped. "The farmland is operational. I assumed when I checked that Greer was simply collecting from the tenants and keeping a portion," she said. "Yes, but the portion has grown. It's closer to a half now." She slid another paper across the desk. "This is what the land should be generating, based on acreage and the market rates for this county. This is what's been deposited to the estate account." He looked at the two figures side by side. She gave him a moment to do the arithmetic. "I see," he said. His voice was very level. "And you found this in? How long have you been here?" 6 weeks. He was quiet again. The clock in the hall ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the overgrown garden. "I should have been paying attention," he said. "Not to her, exactly. More to the room." "You had other things," she said. She didn't say it to excuse him. She said it because it was true. And because she thought he needed someone to acknowledge it without making it a comfort. He looked at her then, really looked. She held the look without flinching. "What do you propose?" he said. She had been waiting for that question. She had been preparing for it. In the evenings after Mrs. Foss brought supper and the house went quiet, in the careful notes she had been making in the margin of the household ledger. She pulled the notes across the desk and began. It took 3 months. There were letters to solicitors and counter-letters from Greer's people, who had, in the manner of men caught mid-scheme, first denied everything, and then offered a partial settlement, and then, when Isidora's documentation proved more complete than anyone had expected, gone quite suddenly quiet. There were interviews with the tenants, Silas, and a widow named Mrs. Garner, who farmed the eastern parcel, and 2 brothers, the Phelps brothers, who had taken over a 3rd section from their father. All of them had receipts. All of them had been paying rent in good faith. None of them had ever been contacted by anyone claiming to act on behalf of Holt Manor directly. There were 2 meetings with a judge in Boston. Julian attended both. Isidora attended both, sitting beside him at a long table, with her documentation arranged in the order in which she would need it, which was a different order than the one that felt emotionally logical, and required her to think about structure rather than grievance. Julian, she noticed, watched her in those meetings the way a person watches someone do something they have never seen done before. Greer and Son was dissolved. The back rent, the difference between what had been collected and what had been deposited, was partially recovered, enough to repair the east wing roof and restock the kitchen garden properly and bring on 2 additional staff for the house. Mrs. Foss, on the day the settlement arrived, made a pot of tea without being asked and brought it to the office where Isidora was closing the last of the files. She set it down without saying anything. Isidora looked up. "Thank you," Isidora said. "You'll want to look at the garden next," Mrs. Foss said. "Before winter." She left. Isidora poured the tea and sat for a moment with her hands wrapped around the cup. The house was quieter than it had been, but a different kind, not to Emmett. Just still. Julian did not leave after the legal matter resolved. She noticed this the way she noticed everything. Without comment, tracking it, filing it away. He had a study on the 2nd floor that he used in the mornings. He took meals in the dining room, which required the dining room to be usable, which required a cleaning and the removal of the furniture sheets, which happened the week he returned, and which changed the whole character of the ground floor in a way that Isidora found herself grateful for, though she did not say so. They talked at meals, slowly at first, about the estate, the repairs, the tenant relations, the practical machinery of a house being brought back to itself, then gradually about other things. She told him about the market where she'd started buying fresh vegetables, now that the kitchen garden was only partly restored. He told her about a property dispute his family had dealt with when he was a boy, the first time he'd understood that land could be fought over, that it had weight and history beyond its practical use. "Is that why you stopped paying attention?" she asked. "Because you'd seen how much trouble paying attention could cause." He was quiet long enough that she thought she had overstepped. Then he said, "Maybe. Or maybe I just stopped believing the details would add up to anything good." She thought about that. "Details are neutral," she said. "They add up to whatever's actually there. The trouble only comes from not looking." He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was the one she had not yet been able to categorize. Not gratitude, not surprise, something quieter and less legible. The kind of look that belongs to a person who has just understood something they'd been circling for a long time without knowing it. She looked back at her plate. She found the letters on a Tuesday in November. She had not been snooping. She had been looking for a secondary ledger that Mrs. Foss mentioned might be stored in the 2nd floor study. Older records, from Julian's father's time. She knocked. There was no answer. The door was unlocked. She went in, intending to scan the shelves and leave. The letters were not hidden. They were in a bundle on the corner of the desk, tied with string, and the top one was addressed in a handwriting that was clearly a woman's. Looped and deliberate, the kind of penmanship taught in girls' schools in another era. They were old. The ink had faded to the color of autumn leaves. She did not read them. She found the ledger on the bottom shelf where Mrs. Foss had said it might be, and she left the study and closed the door behind her, and she stood in the hall for a moment, thinking about what it meant. That Julian kept those letters there, accessible, not locked away, as if he needed them to be reachable without needing to read them often. As if proximity was its own kind of keeping. She had not known he had loved someone. She had assumed an arranged marriage meant no previous attachment, which she recognized now as a very naive assumption. That evening at dinner she asked him, not about the letters, but around them, "Did you always intend to come back to the manor? Or did you have another idea of what your life would look like?" He was quiet, then. There was a time when I thought I'd leave entirely. That the estate was more obligation than home. What changed? He looked at his plate, then at her. Several things, he said. Recently, she did not press, but she did not forget. The east wing roof was repaired in October. The kitchen garden, replanted in late summer, had given them the first harvest by November. Not much, but enough. Isadora had learned the names of all the tenants by then, and their children's names, and which fields drained poorly in spring, and which family had been on the Holt land the longest. She had started a proper filing system for the estate correspondence. She had written a summary of the legal resolution that she sent to Julian's solicitor for the records. She had also, in the spare hours between other work, begun repairing the stone bench by the front gate. She was not skilled at it. She had to ask Silas for help. But she wanted it done, and she had stopped being embarrassed about the things she didn't yet know how to do, because not knowing how to do something was simply the first step before knowing. Julian found her there one Saturday afternoon, crouched in the gravel with a trowel and a bucket of mortar, squinting at the crack she was trying to fill. "Mrs. Foss told me you were out here," he said. "She told you because she thinks I'm making a mess of it," Isadora said, not looking up. He looked at the bench. He looked at her work. "You've got the angle wrong. I know. Would you like?" "Yes," she said before he finished asking. He crouched beside her and showed her how to angle the trowel so the mortar seated properly in the crack. He had done this before, she could tell by the ease in his hands. She watched, then tried it herself. He didn't take over, he just watched. "Your father taught you?" she said. "His groundskeeper. I followed him around for a summer when I was 11. A pause. "My father thought it was beneath the family. His groundskeeper thought I was underfoot. I thought it was the best summer of my life." She pressed the mortar into the crack. It held. "Isadora," he said. She looked up. He used her name so rarely. They were still mostly formal with each other. Titles and last names, the habits of a marriage that had begun without intimacy and was only now finding its way toward something else. "I owe you an accounting," he said. She waited. "When I walked away after the ceremony, I want you to understand that it was not a judgment of you. It was the only way I knew to manage. I was not in a state to be anyone's husband. I thought absence was the kindest thing I could offer." He paused. "I was wrong about that. I think distance dressed up as consideration is still just distance." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Why did you agree to the marriage?" he asked. Just the question, plainly put, the one that had been sitting in her since the church steps. He was quiet for a long moment. A bird moved in the bare hedge to the left. The wind came off the fields. "Because your father told me you were the most capable woman he'd ever met," Julian said. "And because I was in a state where I needed something to believe in that wasn't me." He paused. "That sounds like I was using you." "You were," she said. "A little. Yes, so was my father," she said. "And so was I, for that matter. I wanted a house to manage. I wanted something to do with the parts of me that had no other place to go." She looked at the bench. "I don't think that's the worst foundation." He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said. "I don't think it is either." In December, Julian moved his morning work from the second-floor study to the office on the ground floor, where there was better light. He didn't make an announcement about it. One morning there were simply 2 desks in use instead of 1, and a second lamp on the windowsill, and she found she did not mind. They worked side by side in the mornings, she on the estate accounts, he on correspondence she didn't ask about and he didn't explain. Occasionally one of them would say something out loud, a figure that needed checking, a name that required a response, and the other would answer, and they would go back to work. It was the most intimate arrangement Isadora had ever been part of. More intimate, she thought sometimes, than she had expected marriage to be. Not because it was romantic, but because it was real. The bundle of letters stayed in the study, which was now mostly used for storage. She never asked about them. He never mentioned them. She had decided that there was enough in the present to tend to without excavating everything that had calcified before she arrived. One evening in January, Julian set down his pen and said, without looking up, "Her name was Charlotte. She died 4 years ago." Isadora kept her eyes on her ledger. "I'm sorry," she said. "She would have liked you," he said. "She believed in people who knew what they were for." Isadora thought about this. "What am I for?" she asked. Not fishing for a compliment. Actually asking. He looked at her then, the look she'd been trying to name since October, and she thought she finally had a word for it now. It was the look of a man who has come back to himself, and is surprised to find, in the same house, someone he hadn't accounted for, and now cannot imagine accounting without. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I find I'm very interested to see." She looked down at the ledger. The numbers were in order, the columns balanced. Outside, the January wind was at the windows, but the house was warm. Not dramatically, not in the way of grand gestures and transformation scenes, but in the way of a place where someone has been paying attention. Where the fires are kept lit. Where the windows are sealed and the pantry is full and the roof holds. She had done that, not for him, exactly. She had done it because it needed doing, and she was there, and she was the kind of person who does what needs doing. But she found that she was glad he was there to notice.